Construction makers.
We talked a little bit about the commander changes already, but we did not realize how controversial the idea of hybrid mana becoming what hybrid mana is supposed to be, in it being an either or color, in being included in deck. We didn't realize how controversial that would be. So we thought we would do a deep dive specifically on the hybrid mana situation and just sort of weigh in from our sort of design perspective. First, let's fully explain the hybrid mana, right? And it's that in the rules of Magic, a hybrid mana symbol is treated as either or. And this is to provide that kind of flexibility to both monocolor and two-color decks. Commander has color restrictions that the rest of Magic does not have, which is that your commander has a color identity, and that means you can only play cards of the colors of your commander in your deck. Yeah. So currently, if you were playing a blue-white commander, you could not play Kitchen Finks in your deck, even though you can technically cast that card with only white mana.
First, we're going to cover some of the complaints. We've sort of narrowed down the main community complaints that people have discussed. So the first one is that it leads to more homogenization of deck building. So an example of this is someone saying that, well, okay, my mono white deck can now use Azorius cards, and that's way too good. That's way too powerful.
So I think the argument for this one is basically a concern that a card could be printed that is powerful, that you could play for white mana or for blue mana because it's hybrid or one of each, and then players would want that card in more decks because of its power, and therefore you would end up with a card in a lot more decks because those decks would want to play that card. And the concern, I think, is that that a player who shares this idea is that they are concerned that you would see a lot more of the same card in a lot more decks, right? Because technically, if a card is, let's just stick with Kitchen Finks because that's the easiest thing to come back to. Basically, any deck that has white color identity, it can be played in. It can also be played in any deck that has green color identity. So therefore, Kitchen Finks fits in a lot more decks than if it's treated as a white and green creature, meaning it can only be played in a deck that has white and green color identity, right, minimum. So I see the argument. The argument is that if you had a staple, that would then appear in a lot more decks because of its versatility.
Right. So the second complaint that we've heard the most of is that Wizards of the Coast is affecting the rules of Commander, which is a player-made format.
The reason why I could see players being concerned about Wizards making these changes rather than the players sort of being the ones to choose to make these changes is that it does feel like there was a kind of I shouldn't say like adversarial relationship, but there's kind of a check on power, I guess, when the format is managed outside of Wizards of the Coast, because then you theoretically have a governing body that is has the players' best interests in mind. Whether or not they are correct in their assessment of what the players want is a whole nother story, but theoretically their motivation is, how do we maintain this format the best we can, not how do we sell cards?
Right. And Wizards ideally is trying to do both. However, the fact that they need money can sometimes conflict with that. So now that we've kind of gone through these complaints, I guess, what are our arguments against this?
Well, first let's start with Mark Rosewater.
Sure.
He just had his episode, his Drive to Work podcast, talking about his arguments for hybrid mana in terms of why he thinks that it should be treated in the same way it's treated in every other format of Magic. So let's go through just sort of a brief overview of his points from his podcast. And then after that, we're going to talk about our specific points. But if you want to listen to the rest of Mark's episode, you can find his podcast Drive to Work on Spotify. It's a great podcast, goes in depth about design work. Really an invaluable resource. So
yes.
Make sure you check it out.
Yes. So we sort of summarized Mark's arguments into the top three things. First one being hybrid mana was designed for flexibility versus rigidity of two color pairs.
Right. And this basically just means that like when they design a hybrid card, they design it to be able to go in either color. So the idea that like the color identity of these things being like breaking the color pie and people being concerned about white being able to do direct damage or something. That's not really something they would put on a hybrid card anyway, right? We can look at the card Lightning Helix. It does 3 damage. You gain 3 life, but there's a solid red pip on it and there's a solid white pip on it. So that's what he's saying with like the rigidity of two color pairs, right? Is that there are very specific things that the colors can do And then there's overlap of what some of the colors can do. And the hybrid cards, theoretically, and up to this point, have all been things that both colors should be able to do.
I can understand some of the player hesitation with that, only because there's been a lot of new changes and cards that have started to break out of their usual color pie groupings. And so, it's been a while since we've really seen a large level of exploration of hybrid mana cards. And so with Lorwyn coming up, I could see some people being concerned that, they're going to sort of power creep these or have cards that maybe can be used in particular colors that do things they shouldn't be able to do. But this is us sort of having to put our faith and trust into the designers having our best interests in a balanced format.
Yeah, or at least the best interest is the game in mind. So another reason that Mark brought up is that this is what he says is one of the only reasons one of the only rules in Commander that is strictly against the design intent of hybrid mana. The intent of hybrid mana is that it is supposed to be or. It's that Kitchen Finks, you can play it for 2 green and a colorless, or 2 white and a colorless, or a green and a white and a colorless. The flexibility is the point of hybrid mana. The design intent of the hybrid cards from the beginning, coming out in original Ravnica, Ravnica is based around 2 color pairings, right? We have 2 color pairings for each of the guilds. This is something that he gets into on his podcast. And the hybrid mana is designed in a way to sort of bridge gaps between these solid 2 color pairings.
Finally, Commander is an exclusive color system, and Magic is inclusive.
When Mark mentions this, he basically talks about how Commander is defined by excluding colors from your deck. And Magic outside of Commander is defined by the colors that you choose to include in your deck.
There's a level of pressure when you are including more colors into your deck that is naturally balanced by the fact that you now have to have more colors to play those things, meaning you're more likely to not run into those colors. And ideally, the format is balanced around that. This becomes trickier when there's an Eternal format that has so many cards available to it that it starts to be more consistent, that you can have those color pips played. However, we don't know if that's still the right level or wrong level of consistent to inconsistent that is necessary to keep this balance going.
Okay, so let's start getting into our personal arguments about.
Right. So we've laid out the player complaints. We've talked about Mark's specific arguments as to why he thinks it's a good addition or a good rule change. So now let's kind of get into our pros of the rule change, our cons of the rule change, etc. We were pretty surprised to see the amount of drama and contention that players had for this potential rule change.
I think part of this comes from just content creators coming out like really early after this change was announced and coming out pretty staunchly against it. I get the impulse to think that you don't want Commander to change. Like, you don't want things to change. You think that this can only, change can only lead to bad things. You're very concerned about Wizards of the Coast previously making promises that they never kept. If they're saying, hey, we're going to, start printing a bunch of hybrid cards, and we promise they won't end up as staples in all the decks. The problem is that, that is kind of just a slippery slope fallacy argument, right? Yeah. Is you're basically saying, well, they could do this. Yeah. It could lead to this outcome. When the argument really should be made once it has led to that outcome, and then what do you do about it as a governing body?
They could also have printed the One Ring, and they did, but we didn't know that it was going to end up being like that, right? We don't know the outcome of what the company's going to do and how they're going to print cards.
And you mentioning One Ring brings up, I think, one argument for hybrid mana, which is that the alternative is that they could print artifacts that literally go in any deck, or they can use hybrid mana as a tool to still keep things locked off to specific colors, but make them more flexible in your ability to cast them.
Kind of gets into our first pro, which is really interesting, because this is something that I think you wanted to talk about for a little while now, and you have a nice little chart for it.
I do have a nice graphic. Here it is.
And so this is a little bit counter to what the player complaints are about being concerned that this leads to homogenization of decks. And I think you generally have the counter argument to that, which is actually that this opens up the possibility space for wider range of decks.
Yeah. I don't know why Commander players in particular focus so much on staples. I think it probably has something to do with the singleton format, in that a singleton format pushes you towards individually powerful cards rather than card synergies that like build something greater when they're put together, because you just can't really like rely on getting those things necessarily.
Right. We've talked about the quantity versus quality decks.
Yeah. Right. And so I think that Commander's systems lend itself to be a sort of staple heavy type of format rather than things that like create synergies between cards to create interesting play patterns, which honestly is one of my biggest complaints about Commander, is that the decks start to feel very samey because basically you're just looking for the best individually powerful cards and then you build up economy from there.
And that exists with and without the hybrid mana rule.
Oh, sure, right.
Regardless of what new cards are introduced into the card pool, this is just something that Commander is always going to sort of suffer from.
So back to the argument at hand, and it's that when we look at sort of like what creates the biggest possibility space for combinations of cards, I would argue that Magic systems land smack dab in the middle of this, where Commanders lean sort of in one direction. So let me sort of explain what this graphic is first. This graphic is basically showing the possibility space of deck construction. And it's saying that if you have no colors at all, no restrictions at all in your game, that means that you're going to end up minimizing the possible deck, right? The possible created decks down to players being able to combine all of the best cards at no cost.
Right. A great example of this is Yu-Gi-Oh! Yes. Specifically early Yu-Gi-Oh!, where the metas were almost always either only the Chaos deck, which was the top deck, or it was an AB sort of a meta. And it wasn't until they started introducing archetypes, which is essentially their way of creating colors, that we started seeing more diversity in decks.
Right. And so Yu-Gi-Oh! Also ends up kind of on the opposite end of this with their archetypes, which is basically saying that you have hard-locked colors. And what that means is that when you have hard-locked colors, you end up with the best cards of that color, or the best decks in each of those colors. And then those sort of just are the things that get played against each other. And then once you figure out which is the best of those colors, then that is just the best deck. So on both opposite ends of the spectrum here, you end up crunching the possibility space because you are you're either having no limitations so that you can just play the best stuff, or you're having very specific limitations that hard lock things to colors, which means that you are effectively just creating no colors for each of the colors you have. And so what we want is this in-between sort of inclusive system that says you can play anything that you want at a cost. And then you have to do the risk-reward analysis with every deck that you build that says, okay, I'm gonna lose some amount of consistency for adaptability, for variety.
Right. It's sort of a self-filtering system, right? Because the more that you end up adding these colors, if you say, oh, well, blue's really great, but red has these great cards and black has these good cards, so I'm going to have a blue, red, black deck, right? Now you trying to dip your toes into so many different colors, now you have the consequence of potentially a less consistent deck because you're now having to try and color fix to get these cards that you really want.
So the other thing that we need to understand in combination with this possibility space graphic is how Magic's mana system actually works. And they have a ton of granularity in terms of how you create a mana cost for a card. They have the total number of mana that it costs to play the card, and then they have color pips. And the more total mana, the later in the game that it is will theoretically need to be to cast this spell. And the more color pips you have, the more dedicated to that color you have to be in order to cast it. And hybrid mana does something really, really interesting with the casting system. You can give a card a lot of color pips that are still colored color pips, but they are generically colored for two color decks that fit those hybrid colors. So that's kind of confusing. So let me see if I can walk through an example that makes this make more sense. The most extreme examples of this make it easy for us to visualize. So if we look at Overbeing of Myth, which is a card from original Lorwyn that costs...
Might be Shadowmoor.
Or Shadowmoor.
It's the Lorwyn block.
Lorwyn block. When we look at this card, it costs 5 hybrid color pips, which in a monocolored deck means that all of your mana can be used to cast this at 5. In a 2-color deck that is both blue and green, right, you can use all of your mana to cast this. So in both monocolor and 2-color decks, this is effectively a card that is at its most easy to cast. If we add in a 3rd color to that deck, it becomes more difficult to cast this because any mana pip or any land we control that only adds that third color cannot be used to cast this. So when we look at combining and putting this card into a 3-color deck that only has one of this card's colors, it becomes extremely difficult to cast. Basically, if we look at putting this in any other deck that does not have both blue and green in its land base, this card becomes extremely difficult to cast because you must treat this as having all of one color pip. This is 5 color pips in one color. So if you have a deck that's both blue and red, if you have mountains in your deck, they can't cast this spell.
So let's say if you did want to include this, green-blue hybrid card in your blue-red deck, you could do that. Maybe you want it for whatever reason in your deck, but yeah, it becomes significantly harder for you to cast it because now you need 5 solid blue pips, which I think I said earlier, Commander players, I think, have become a little disillusioned to the amount of color pips on a particular card because I think the games go for so long, and I think that there are these opportunities to color fix. But I think that, I don't think players recognize as often when that happens, right? And oftentimes you're not playing that many cards that play that many color pips, right? I think your average card at most is probably going to have 1 to 2 solid color pips. It's when you start getting 3 and up that you start, getting into that territory that you might be in trouble, depending on how many colors you play in your deck.
The main point of this is to say that that Magic's casting system has the restrictions already built in to handle this kind of a thing. And by gating these hybrid mana cards away from the multicolored, or the singular color that they could be played as, I think you are hurting monocolor and 2-color decks more than you are hurting, say, a 3-color deck that is trying to play this and is only in one of the color identities of this card. And that is the system itself balancing out. It's not saying you can't do it. Right. It's saying you can, but it's difficult.
When it comes to the homogenization of this, that really bothers me. The idea that there's just going to be these new staples that are put in is currently not every blue deck that has blue in its abilities, in its identity, plays Rhystic Study. Now, that doesn't make sense. Every blue deck should play Rhystic Study. It's the best blue card, at the very least a Mystic Remora, but people don't. And why is that? And it's because everyone's already playing a suboptimal deck. Unless you're playing CEDH, you are playing a just fundamentally worse deck than the top tier decks, meaning that you're already ignoring many staples as is, right? It is players' decision outside of these color limitations to not put these staples and better cards in their decks already.
Okay, so let's talk about what we see as potential cons for allowing hybrid mana.
Yeah, so as much as I love Mark Rosewater, I do have my own little gripes with how this would be defined in the rules.
Specifically in Commander.
Specifically in Commander. And I think really it's that there's these separate rules for deck construction that are different from the rules of play. And so currently the rules of deck construction in Commander that's tied to identity is that we are deciding that these hybrid cards are an either or, right? If something like a Kitchen Finks, it's green-white.
Is green-white?
If Kitchen Finks is green-white, right now it is being defined currently as green and white for the deck construction color identity rules. And what the rule change would be is that it's green or white. The problem is that when you're actually playing the game and you decide to cast Kitchen Finks and Kitchen Finks is now on the battlefield, you don't get to decide whether that's green or white. That is a green and a white card, meaning that if a spell says destroy target green card, you can't suddenly say, well, no, it's actually in my mono white deck. White. It's a white card.
Right. Yeah.
And I think that little confusion is where, to me, it's not necessarily like a non-starter, but I understand the hesitation because I feel that does add quite a bit of complexity with how people are going to be understanding how color identity functions.
I think part of this is Commander systems being exclusionary and being prescriptive about this is how you should build a deck, rather than letting Magic's systems dictate whether or not you can build that deck, right? It's that you can say, Magic systems say, yes, You can do whatever you want, but it's going to cost you. Commander systems say you can't do whatever you want.
I hope that people hear what we say in this video and like really, really try to internalize this, because there is, I think, zero evidence that this is somehow going to break the game.
Yeah, no.
And
No.
somehow people have taken this as this is the end of the format. Like, this would just destroy all decks. All decks are going to be the same now. And it's like, buddy, I hate to break it to you, but yeah, they are all the same at the top. They're all blue farm. Like, so I don't know what to tell. Like, yeah, if you decide to play to the most optimal, you're right. All decks are the same, but you're not. You're down here with the casuals. So you make whatever deck you want to make, and it's totally fine.
Yeah. From a design perspective, I think that hybrid mana is a really elegant and a really useful tool for design. The main thing here is that you can kind of trust Magic's systems that the restriction for these cards is already inherently built into them, which is that the colored pips are there. You're not going to get as much crossover into like 3 color decks as you might think, and monocolor and two color decks are helped out the most, which I think is something that, you know, I think we all could say, hey, I wish I saw more monocolor decks in Commander, because it just really doesn't happen that much.
If you enjoyed listening to us talk about hybrid mana, please feel free to give us a little like and a subscribe, maybe a comment down below.
If you love hybrid mana, you can join our Discord. The link's in the description. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.
Bye.